Everybody who flew said there were people who died, and they could tell us how many. So we began to calculate what percentages of death we were hearing about here. When people arrived in the site, there was no preparation for them. Illness was rampant, and many people spent most of the night burying the dead. We were worried about the account of refugee possibly being either exaggerated or a select group that maybe they had seen more difficult conditions than most, so we cut that figure in half. We cut our figures in half, we cut our figures in half again, and we came with 100,000 that quite probably died as a result of the way the resettlement program was conducted.
I think it's a gross exaggeration to talk about hundreds of thousands dying in the operation. There is absolutely no substance to that, as Kurt Jansen makes very clear in his book.
Jansen bitterly attacked cultural survival's figures in his book on the famine emergency, published in 1987. But some Western agencies and governments did publicly protest against resettlement at the time. Today, there is little doubt that thousands died.
There has never been a systematic follow-up study of this. Despite the fact that these numbers were very controversial, nobody has ever moved to disprove them.
Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, had seen some of what cultural survival described. They publicly attacked the resettlement program and were duly expelled by the Ethiopians.
The expelled agency claims dozens die each day in the transit camps. Camps which are like cesspools with people on top of one another who literally swim in excrement.
We leave behind an extraordinary investment, I mean human investment, personal investment, and of course material, physical investment. And we are deeply sorry, but I don't think that we have, when we know what we know, when we see what we have seen, we cannot keep quiet.
The French agency's position was and remains highly controversial. Many aid agencies felt they were jeopardizing the saving of lives. Before going public, Beaumont had met the UN chief in Addis, Kurt Jansen's successor there.
The head of the UN system in Addis accused me to be a liar. He said, I have no reason to think whatsoever that the people leave these relief camps against their will. This is exactly what he told me.
I frankly thought he was grandstanding. I think he was wanting to be expelled and knew he would be expelled. And lo and behold, it happened.
Why would he want to do that?
To get publicity.
Should we have united, 10 important relief groups, should we have united and held a press conference in Addis saying, okay, we've tried to help. Now we realize that we are accomplices not of help, but of massive oppression and killing of the Ethiopian people, and we don't accept that. The Ethiopian government, I think, would have been obliged to stop it.
Oh, I could have got hold of Michael Burke or whoever in the media field and had a press conference at any time and said that this is unacceptable, and I would have been out on the next plane and the resettlement activity would have continued. So you have to weigh cause and effect. I mean, is it worth it?
They never tested their strength. They assumed that they would be expelled. They listened to a strong man who made threats to them, who didn't have complete control over his own country, who did definitely shoot down his opponents on sight and had a reputation for that. But they were the United Nations, and they never flexed their muscle in a single case that I know of. If they had taken a different position, things might have gone very differently.
Soon after meeting Beaumont, Michael Priestley went north with Ethiopian officials from the government's RRC, the Relief and Rehabilitation Commission.
Virtually the first thing I was asked to do by Mengistu personally was to review the extent of the resettlement operation and to advise him. And I was sent around in a government twin otter and together with staff from the RRC, and we looked at a number of resettlement areas.
These people flew into my area. We went to the transit camp in Dessie.
it'd been cleaned up. I mean, it'd been amazingly cleaned up, and so the things that I'd seen before were not visible then.
Michael Priestley says he was shocked by what he did see, and that quiet diplomacy, not public slanging matches, won the day with Mengistu.
I immediately went back to him and in writing strongly recommended what my predecessor Kurt Jansen had already done on a number of occasions, that they cease the resettlement operation immediately. Mengistu wasn't always very responsive to things he didn't want to hear, but the fact remains is that it was suspended within a matter of a week, 10 days after that presentation.
Resettlement didn't come to an end. In 85 it was postponed for 6 months. It was restarted again, and then it was improved upon in the eyes of the government, where the entire South, 4 million people, were villagized.
Some continued to support resettlement, and in 1987 Michael Priestley himself, still the UN chief in Ethiopia, spoke on BBC Radio in favour of it.
Resettlement is clearly got to be part of the solution. The natural resource base of the highlands is rapidly going downhill. So inevitably I think you have to look at short-term measures to relieve that pressure on the land. And obviously those farmers have to be moved off their slopes. They have to go to other parts of Ethiopia which are uncrowded.
So here we are. We end up back in Coram, a place that first raised all your indignation, and rage and shame.
The figures are terribly difficult at the end of the day as a result of the international engagement represented by Bob Geldof. Of those 3 million people who would have died, only about who knows how accurate these figures are, but only about 900,000 people died. So 2 million people did not die.
Nobody can claim with a shred of credibility that if 10 million people were affected, 500,000 died, relief saved the other 9.5 million. The great majority of the contribution to people's survival is through their own efforts. Relief is a small contribution.
The relief operations saved, I don't know how many lives, but it saved thousands of lives. The problem that it condemned to death another hundreds, tens of thousands of lives, because it accepted to be accomplice of a policy of oppression, of a murderous utopia in Ethiopia. So it could have saved many more lives in Ethiopia, complying with its own principles, but it forgot its principle on the way.
In 1991, Mengistu fell from power and fled the country. Some 5,000 of his henchmen have been charged with crimes, including conspiracy and genocide. The UN official Kurt Jansen wrote in his book on the famine emergency, "My overall impression of Chairman Mengistu was one of intelligence, quiet dignity, reserve, and great courtesy."
In most of Africa, they introduce the notion that we simply do what the Europeans say. They're better educated than we are, and they know better. The bitter truth is that the outside world has not known better. It has only known worse. People are not prepared to admit that. They think, though, it must be true that we know better. Dear friends, you don't know better.
Do you think then, as we end this century, that we are all a little less arrogant than we used to be?
Daniel, I hope we are, and if we're not, God help us. We're God help us after this century we've been through.
Tonight here on BBC Two, decoding the rules of engagement, future war on the gentlemen of the battlefield.